Hi, this is Robin Andreasen of South Texas College's English Department, and I'm here to talk to you about one of Toni Morrison's final written works before she passed away, and uh, the problem of cultural identity via the work of Cornel West. And I'm coming to you today uh, to discuss these two authors and thinkers because I believe that they have a lot of wisdom, they have a lot to offer to us, they give us a lot to think about in terms of what race means in America and maybe how we can move beyond that towards a better sense of what it is to be human. And sort of throw off the shackles of the past. So I hope you appreciate the discussion today. Thanks for joining me. Um, we're going to be looking at four different pieces. One short video clip from Cornel West, and then we're delving a little bit deeper into his essay Nihilism in Black America. And we're going to look at a short video excerpt from Toni Morrison's interview with Charlie Rose from 2015 and her essay Mourning for Whiteness in the 2016 New Yorker.
Nihilism, democracy, common good. Yeah, well, nihilism, of course, is wrestling with hopelessness, with helplessness, with lovelessness. And there can be no democracy when nihilism rules. You have to have some structures of feeling. You have to have some structures of value that accent the rule of demos, the rule of the people, the rule of ordinary people, the rule of everyday people. And therefore, you have to have some vision of a future tied to common good and public interest for any democracy to have a chance to flourish and flower. We need a fundamental commitment to public interest and the common good, what it means to be a citizen, not simply what it means to be a consumer, not simply what it means to be a person tied to private gain. How do we focus on the things that tie us together, bond us together? This is why grotesque wealth inequality. This is why xenophobia. It could be against indigenous peoples. It could be against Muslims. It could be against gays and lesbians and trans and bisexuals. It can be against black people. It can be against brown people. How do we accent the degree to which we either hang together or we hang separately? Well, democracy is a rule of everyday people. Democracy is very rare in human history. Most history has to do with oligarchs, plutocrats, kings, queens, monarchs, suzerain, ruling things. And even in those societies that call themselves democracies, when you have oligarchs in financial services, when you have plutocrats in corporate contexts, they end up being the permanent government, and everyday people feel as if their voices are relatively hopeless, helpless, impotent, and unable to be effective in shaping their destiny. So that democracy is always a process. Democracy actually is much more a verb than it is a noun. It's a process, it's an activity, and right now, all around the world, democracies are under tremendous threat.
In this short piece from the Democracy Project, West wants us to understand what he conceives of as a viable democracy and what he thinks is nihilism or the kind of despair of a lot of people confronting poverty, racism, a society that uh, doesn't love them when they put their all in and they try to be productive members of society. He he gives a brief definition of nihilism as resting on being in a state of hopelessness, helplessness, lovelessness. And he argues there's no room for democracy when nihilism rules, when people are apathetic, when they don't care, when they don't feel the system is going to be able to do anything to improve their lives. And he's really arguing that we have to have structures of feeling, right? Like building empathy, right? Structures of value, as in morality, as in principles to live by, that accent the rule of ordinary people. And when he's arguing for what he thinks a working democracy really is, he says, we need a fundamental commitment to public interest and the common good, what it means to be a citizen, and not simply what it means to be a consumer or a person tied to private gain. And that idea of rich and vibrant citizenship, of what it means to be someone who fights for one's rights, that's a powerful current throughout this piece, and we should note that, of course, he's talking about a history of black people being denied the right to vote, of black people's votes being considered invalid. And we were just seeing that these last few weeks during this period of the presidential election. So he wants black people, brown people, people who are minorities, to make sure that they struggle to be participants in the system and not give in to despair and not be apathetic. And also that we should struggle or aspire to be more than simply consumers or people looking out for simply our own gain. Um, Another interesting comment he makes here: when you have oligarchs, plutocrats, they end up being the permanent government, and you have everyday people feeling hopeless, helpless, impotent, and unable to be effective in shaping their destiny. Against the wealth inequality, xenophobia, and racism and intolerance that he argues leads to nihilism, West argues for a more complete sense of what it means to live in a democracy. He argues that democracy is much more a verb than a noun, a fluid state versus a sacred document, and that democracies around the world are under threat in a way that we have not seen before. Um, in West's famous essay from the 90s, Nihilism in Black America, he elaborates on this condition of nihilism, which I explained before as helplessness, hopelessness, lovelessness. And he tries to talk about, basically the two rough socio-political approaches to the problem of nihilism, of apathy and despair in black communities. Um, Recent discussions about the plight of African Americans, especially those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, tend to divide into two camps. There are those who highlight the structural constraints on the life chances of black people. Their viewpoint involves a subtle historical and sociological analysis of slavery, Jim Crowism, job and residential discrimination, skewed unemployment rates, inadequate health care, and poor education. On the other hand, there are those who stress the behavioral impediments on black upward mobility. They focus on the waning of the Protestant work ethic, hard work, deferred gratification, frugality, and responsibility in much of black America. Those in the first camp, the liberal structuralists, call for full employment, health, education, and childcare programs and broad affirmative action practices. In short, a new, more sober version of the New Deal and the Great Society: more government money, better bureaucrats, and an active citizenry. Those in the second camp, the conservative behaviorists, promote self-help programs, black business expansion, and non-preferential job practices. They support rigorous free market strategies that depend on fundamental changes in how black people act and live. To put it bluntly, their projects rest largely upon a cultural revival of the Protestant ethic. And, in his basic diagnosis here, we see the rough contours of liberal and conservative in the United States. One group believes in government infrastructure, in funding child care, and improving affirmative action, and improving access to health care. The other group believes in promoting black business success, self-help programs, non-affirmative action in favor of a competitive and free market, pull yourself up by your bootstraps thinking. And, West traces this work ethic back to the Protestants, right, to the Pilgrims who founded our country. And their sort of religious ideas about what it meant to be a productive member of society. West argues in his essay that these roughly liberal and conservative viewpoints suffocate real attention to Black lives and identity, these sort of basic liberal and conservative perspectives. He makes three crucial points. We must acknowledge that behavior and structures are inseparable. Institutions and values go hand in hand. We should reject the idea that structures are primarily economic and political creatures, an idea that sees culture as an ephemeral set of behavioral attitudes and values. Culture is as much a structure as the economy or politics. It is rooted in institutions such as families, schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, and communication industries, TV, radio, video, music. Similarly, the economy and politics are not only influenced by values, but also promote particular cultural ideals of the good life or good society. And in this discussion, of the way in which ideology and culture go hand in hand, we see that, Cornel West is trying to explain to us how ideological systems work in a society, how they're grounded in actual real life practices, on how racism can become institutionalized, and so on and so forth. And so he wants us to understand the value of culture to sort of change how people see the world. Um, West argues that the economic and political focus of liberal structuralists often ignores the despair and dread felt by Black Americans, as such thinkers emphasize economic empowerment and political engagement without regard for the psychological impact of poverty, of racism. Conversely, the conservative behaviorists ignore the economic and political realities of Black Americans, instead focusing on values and attitudes to the exclusion of all else. Conservative behaviorists also discuss Black culture as if acknowledging one's obvious discrimination through white supremacist practices, compounded by sexism and class definition, is taboo. They tell people to see themselves as agents, not victims. West argues that this advice, while well-meaning, sort of conservative position, pays little attention to the lived conditions of Black people across generations, struggling to survive through slavery and its aftermath. Self-help and personal responsibility are wrenched out of historical context and contemporary context, as if it is all a matter of personal will. West elaborates on nihilism, and some of what he has to say here echoes what was in that short video I showed you. Nihilism is to be understood here not as a philosophic doctrine that there are no rational grounds for legitimate standards or authority. It is far more the lived experience of coping with a life of meaninglessness, hopelessness, and most important, lovelessness. The frightening result is a numbing detachment from others and a self-destructive disposition toward the world. Life without meaning, hope, or love breeds a cold-hearted, mean-spirited outlook that destroys both the individual and others. West argues for a sort of cultural armor to combat nihilism, and this is where the art of Toni Morrison and other literary and artistic titans comes in. Art thus becomes a way of coping, of finding hope, meaning, and love. West on this issue of cultural armor. The genius of our Black foremothers and forefathers was to create powerful buffers to ward off the nihilistic threat, to equip Black folk with cultural armor to beat back the demons of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and lovelessness. These buffers consisted of cultural structures of meaning and feeling that created and sustained communities. This armor constituted ways of life and struggle that involved values of service and sacrifice, love and care, and discipline and excellence. West notes, however, that this cultural armor, these Black support networks, started to wane in the last 50 years for reasons too complex for us to explore here today, although West mentions two factors in particular that are worth considering. I believe the two significant reasons why the threat is now more powerful than ever before are the saturation of market forces and market moralities in Black life and the present crisis in Black leadership. West argues that our profit-driven society seeks pleasure over all else, and that this effectively functions often as a distraction from attending to the ills of society for African Americans and all other cultural groups. Self-satisfaction drives out other values such as love, care, and service to others. Cornel West singles out Toni Morrison and her work as a novelist in texts such as The Bluest Eye, and he argues that such novels illustrate the quote unquote harmful way in which white ideals affect the black self image. This is a first step toward rejecting these ideals and overcoming the nihilistic self loathing they engender in blacks. And, of course, he's referring to those sorts of cultural forces that prop up white supremacy in the United States. Redefining what it means to be human, what it means to be black, has been part of Toni Morrison's project over the last 50 years. Calling nihilism a disease of the soul, West argues that Morrison is doing the kind of modern work to create a cultural armor, a love ethic. West makes some powerful points here when he tries to outline this love ethic. Self love and love of others are both modes toward increasing self valuation and encouraging political resistance in one's community. These modes of valuation and resistance are rooted in a subversive memory and guided by a universal love ethic. Beloved can be construed as bringing back the loving yet critical affirmation of black humanity found in the best of black nationalist movements, the perennial hope against hope for transracial coalition and progressive movements, and the painful struggle for self-affirming sanity in a history in which the nihilistic threat seems insurmountable. And when we consider, this idea of a love ethic, for those of you out there who have read Beloved, Baby Suggs represents this. If you've seen the movie, that sort of love and compassion and forgiveness for suffering. That's part of what goes into the love ethic that West sees in Toni Morrison's work. In both the short video from the Democracy Project and West's famous essay, he makes a major call for a renewed idea of citizenship and democratic statesmanship. And despite all we've been through as a society in the last year, I believe we are seeing that renewed idea of citizenship and democracy show up in record voter turnout, in the mainstreaming of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the election of biracial figures like Kamala Harris, who break through the so-called racial boundaries to focus on our shared humanity, not our superficial differences. I'm now going to turn to some quotes that I think are important, some comments from Toni Morrison about 2015, 2016, and the election of Donald Trump, and her sort of diagnosis of a sort of nihilism in white society in terms of the idea of lost status, lost cultural significance. In Toni Morrison's Mourning for Whiteness, one of the last pieces that she wrote, she seeks to understand the Trump phenomenon and ponders the lost status of white America. 5 years before the murders of Jacob Blake and George Floyd, both killed by police, Morrison laments white America's fear and anxiety over race and the death toll we see play out on our TV screens all too often in poor and urban America. She offers a scathing rebuke of this white nihilism that leads to violence. And one of the comments that I think is interesting here is her statement about immigration. All the immigrants to the United States know and knew that if they want to become real, authentic Americans, they must reduce their fealty to their native country and regard it as secondary, subordinate, in order to emphasize their whiteness. Unlike any nation in Europe, the United States holds whiteness as the unifying force. Here, for many people, the definition of Americanness is color. And she wants to underscore there, right, the degree to which conforming to the white ideal is very much a part and has been a part of American history and American life. Another quote that I think, helps us to try to think about the moment we're in right now. Under slave laws, the necessity for color rankings was obvious, But in America today, post-civil rights legislation, white people's conviction of their natural superiority is being lost, rapidly lost. There are people of color everywhere threatening to erase this long understood definition of America. And that idea that the sort of true or authentic or real American, the sort of white American culture that the founding fathers came from, that somehow that is disappearing and being replaced by something that is aberrant, that is dangerous, that doesn't have anything to do with our values. Morrison continues trying to explain her diagnosis of white society in this Trump era. In order to limit the possibility of this untenable change and restore whiteness to its former status as a marker of national identity, a number of white Americans are sacrificing themselves. They have begun to do things they clearly don't really want to be doing, and to do so, they are abandoning their sense of human dignity and risking the appearance of cowardice. Much as they may hate their behavior and know full well how craven it is, they are willing to kill small children attending Sunday school and slaughter churchgoers who invite a white boy to pray. Embarrassing as the obvious display of cowardice must be, they are willing to set fire to churches and to start firing in them while the members are at prayer. And shameful as such demonstrations of weakness are, they are willing to shoot black children in the street. In this quote, this rather sweeping indictment of some of the worst aspects of white society in America today, as we witness the rise of neo-Nazi movements, as we see racially motivated mass shootings, and she's really trying to take to task the concept of America that these white nationalists, that these white supremacists hold close to their hearts. And um, along with Cornel West, along with me, right, she rejects the idea that this white supremacist idea of America is the one that will win out, right, if justice is to prevail. And she argues that white America is losing its dignity, and appears to be afraid and cowardly in their responses on the streets of America in terms of what police officers do, and their political responses, and their desire to not count votes. Um, Morrison continues in her diagnosis of the ills of modern white American society by saying, to keep alive the perception of white superiority, these white Americans tuck their heads under cone-shaped hats and American flags and deny themselves the dignity of face-to-face confrontation, training their guns on the unarmed, the innocent, the scared, on subjects who are running away, exposing their unthreatening backs to bullets. Surely, shooting a fleeing man in the back hurts the presumption of white strength, the sad plight of grown white men crouching beneath their better selves to slaughter the innocent during traffic stops, to push black women's faces into the dirt, to handcuff black children. Only the frightened would do that, right? Morrison asserts that the fear and anxiety, the angst of white America in the Trump era is the result of lost status, of being displaced by all of these other cultures, by all of these new immigrants. Something essential has been lost or stolen: their cultural identity, their country, and most recently in the resistance to the presidential election. Um, and Morrison comments on this. So scary are the consequences of a collapse of white privilege that many Americans have flocked to a political platform that supports and translates violence against the defenseless as strength. These people are not so much angry as terrified, with the kind of terror that makes knees tremble. And Morrison's discussion of fear and cowardice is quite deliberate, right? She wants to rob these groups that seek to terrorize with the brandishing of their guns in open carry, or their marches armed in the streets. She wants to really redefine them not as tough guys, not as proud boys, but rather as scared and confused, right? And sort of in a state of desperation. And to a lot of Americans, as we've been witnessing the events of the last several weeks, I think that this argument actually resonates, right, and gives us a little bit of insight into some of the cultural pressures and cultural fractures that we've been seeing recently. For those who would question the argument about Trump's association with white supremacy, Morrison recounts the racially charged events of 2016 and the Republican campaign leading up to the 2016 election she witnessed. On election day, how eagerly so many white voters, both the poorly educated and the well educated, embraced the shame and fear sowed by Donald Trump, the candidate whose company has been sued by the Justice Department for not renting apartments to black people, the candidate who questioned whether Barack Obama was born in the United States, and who seemed to condone the beating of a Black Lives Matter protester at a campaign rally, the candidate who kept black workers off the floors of his casinos, the candidate who is beloved by David Duke and endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. Toni Morrison elaborated on this moral cowardice in white American society in her interview with Charlie Rose.
Are these troubling times?
Yeah, these are. I think it's, yeah, I'm not sure they're all that different, but it's obvious now. It's very obvious that the times are troubled. Mm-hmm. And a little cowardly,
Yeah.
I think.
How do you think cowardly?
Well, when we think just about the media and the journalistic stories, television stories about young or middle-aged black men being shot by police, what astonishes me is not so many, because there's always been a lot, it's just never been newsworthy, is the obvious cowardice of the police. I don't mean all police, but those that we hear about. How are you afraid of a man running away from you? How are you afraid of somebody standing in a grocery store on a phone with a toy gun that you could buy in the store? How could you be afraid of a little boy? And who are these people who call 911? Who are they? You look out the window and you see a kid with a toy gun and you get on the phone. I like that policeman who was chasing a guy who had killed some people and turned around, faced the policeman and said, "Shoot me, shoot me." And the policeman wouldn't. He said, "I'm not going to shoot you. I'm not going to shoot you." He kept saying it. The guy obviously wanted to be shot, suicide by a cop, but he didn't do it. Then finally took the guy down. But then I realized that that policeman had been in the military. He was not a coward.
Had different training.
Entirely different. He was brave. He stood up. But these guys running around, just popping people over and over again.
How can we change that?
We have to change the police training.
Yeah.
It can be
that's
done.
the obvious.
Well, that's clear.
Yeah.
And, perhaps, I was wondering the same thing during the civil rights, parades when Martin Luther King was around. What can we do? What can we do? Well, in that instance, you had somebody who could actually talk to somebody in the administration.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that that can happen now, in spite of the fact that the President of the United States is a black man.
As we consider the terrible events 5 years later of a man, Jacob Blake, who I referred to earlier, shot 7 times in his back in front of his children in Wisconsin, Toni Morrison's words still have enormous relevance in these racially and politically divided times. Considering her Charlie Rose interview and her piece in The New Yorker together, her lasting message is a warning about what people with a lost sense of identity might do in their fear and cowardice. Much as West diagnosed Black America as nihilism, we might consider that this fascistic moment in American history is a form of white nihilism, a desire to halt the evolution of the American experiment and a craven attempt to return to a white power caste society. When we look at America's issues with gun violence, with nativists, with xenophobes, fear of the other and of change is paramount. This is a fear of the future and a futile one. It will always be up to a new generation of voters and thinkers to push for the society they want. When we consider the concerns of these two writers and thinkers, we see their struggle to defy the vile rhetoric and ideology of racism and redefine the human through the pursuit of an empowering love that is inclusive and abandons concepts of race designed to subjugate non-Western peoples. And I really thank you for your time. Thanks for listening, and take care. We look towards the creation of a more perfect union. Thank you.